Hi everybody, today we're going to be talking about poverty's effects on mood disorders and cognition. So, what is poverty? To paraphrase Richmond Vale Academy, which is an organization I kind of looked into that does really important work in impoverished communities, poverty can be paraphrased to describe people who lack sufficient resources or funds to sufficiently satisfy their basic needs, like food, water, clothing, housing, and so on. There are many factors that result from poverty or that can kind of predispose or put people in a situation to be more likely to incur poor socioeconomic conditions, including the area that they live in, the education that they receive, and the risk factors in their surrounding environment. What's so dangerous about poverty is that, like the arrows kind of show on the screen, people who are in impoverished situations often have a difficult time breaking out of this cycle, which can make it a long term and ever present issue that hundreds of millions of people face worldwide. So there are about 6 different types of poverty that are nationally recognized. They're going to range from looking at like relative poverty, and generational and situational poverty, which are, I'm not going to lie, they're more situational, so they can differ based on circumstance. So people who live in relative poverty, for example, are going to make below the global median income, which isn't as severe as, say, extreme poverty, which is when people cannot even meet their basic needs. Generally, people internationally who are living in these conditions are going to make about $1.25 to $2 per day. And according to World Bank, there are more than 200 million people globally who live in extreme poverty. So, as you can see, compared to like generational poverty, which is kind of like extending over the course of time, or relative or situational poverty, if you're on the lower end of the spectrum looking at it absolute and extreme, it's definitely going to affect your conditions a lot more severely. So these different types of poverty can directly affect people and especially children's development. So typically, if you're in an impoverished situation, you're going to have limited access to healthcare, nutrition, potentially you're going to have housing concerns. Mental and physical health is definitely going to take a toll most of the time, and often that's also due to a lack of good resources or treatment options. And there's also limited quality, I would say, education access. All of these factors are going to increase individuals' chances of experiencing discrimination, among other things, and also, especially in extreme and absolute poverty situations, these factors have been linked to an increased risk of developing a mood or other related mental disorder. These also honestly link back to the environment in which a child is raised. So, from a developmental perspective, often poverty can lead to increased stress on the parent, which then can kind of lead to negative parental relationships with the child, and also the parent's mental health might suffer as well. This can lead to distressing surroundings and an overall unhealthy home environment, meaning that the child may not have a safe place to ultimately return to, which can greatly heighten their risk factor for developing these mood and mental disorders. So now that we've looked at some of the factors that can kind of increase your risk of developing a mood disorder, let's look at cognitive functioning. So what is poverty's effect, or more specifically deprivation's effect, on neurocognitive functioning? Well, to start out, I kind of pulled a couple of studies that I think explain this concept well. So in Chugani et al., they investigated the link between deprivation and cognitive dysfunction, or like the level of intelligence that the children had. So they pulled together some children who were exposed to deprivation in a Romanian orphanage. They were there for about 40 months, and they were adopted into American families and given a series of tests and brain scans. On the intelligence scale, the children scored around an 80, which is well below the average score of a 100, and this is kind of standardized. So therefore, Chugani et al. Kind of showed that deprivation affects brain development because early childhood deprivation in the orphanage that they experienced was associated with dysfunction in certain brain areas later in life. And to kind of expand on this, Behan et al. Looked at the effects of postnatal deprivation on neurocognitive delays, which basically means that they looked at like after you were born, like if you're deprived of like certain resources, how does this affect your intelligence? So they studied this also in orphanages, and while all of the participants showed like basic levels of neurocognitive functioning, 46 of the children showed one area of quote, absolute impairment. So this means that they showed some type of neurocognitive dysfunction in either language, memory, executive function, or like their dexterity, so their ability to kind of like movement, touch, senses, that kind of thing. Also, the children, the longer that the children were in the orphanage, so kind of in a state of deprivation, the more persistent and pervasive the neurocognitive impairments were displayed and kind of carried on for. So I thought that these kind of were very interesting and displayed that cognitive functioning is greatly affected by poverty. So one of the concepts that I think best describes how poverty can influence child development is this concept known as multifinality, which basically refers to this idea that a single risk factor or also like a protective factor could potentially result in different outcomes for different people. So looking at this kind of diagram, now that we've learned a bit about deprivation, how that impacts people's cognitive abilities, and also how poverty can lead to like different mood disorders. Let's pretend two children experience kind of the same early events. So they both are in situations of poverty. They both kind of have a strained family relationship as a result. However, one of the children in their community is going to experience acceptance, and the other child is going to experience a situation of discrimination where they don't feel accepted in their community. For the first child, this may lead to just like some cognitive impairment, because this acceptance kind of leads to them feeling okay. Even though they have the other two risk factors, they have a different outcome than the second child who experiences discrimination. This onset of discrimination paired with the strained family relationship and poverty could possibly lead to a mood disorder because they don't feel supported or accepted in their community. So this also shows that there should be a lot of, diversity and versatility in the treatment options that we have towards people who are experiencing poverty, because everyone's situation is different. It's also so necessary to have good baseline assessment options in a therapeutic setting so that you can kind of help to assess what might be best for the patient in that way too. So what are mood disorders? Mood disorders consist of depression and sometimes mania, which presents in bipolar depression. Depression is going to be a pervasive mood disorder when people are going to remain in a low state for at least 2 weeks. So there are two main types of mood disorders that we're kind of going to be looking at. However, we're going to be talking about unipolar depression much more. So unipolar depression is depression that presents without mania. And it includes a whole network, including major depressive disorder, dysthymic disorder, I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong, and persistent depressive disorder. So those are all different types, but the main one we're going to be looking at is major depressive disorder. There's also bipolar depression, which is when people experience the lows of depression and highs of mania, or in the case of bipolar 2 disorder, it's going to be hypomania, which is like a less severe type. So this is like described as almost like an emotional roller coaster, and people, when they're experiencing mania, are in an extreme frenzied state, and they kind of would go back to depression, which is an extreme low. Depression is also usually addressed with a combination of symptoms. So people often will experience, according to Comer and Comer, emotional symptoms, which is when they'll feel miserable, empty, humiliated, or sad. They kind of will suffer from anhedonia, which is when they don't want to experience any type of pleasure. This can also kind of present itself with like anxiety and anger and just overwhelming emotions. There's motivational symptoms that you can see in people with depressive disorders, which is when they like don't want to pursue their usual activities, and they don't want to go to work, eat. It's kind of like they feel almost like paralyzed, if that makes sense, in doing their daily activities. Behavioral symptoms means that they're just kind of not going to be, people who have depression aren't going to be as productive, so they might just want to like spend time alone, lay in bed, do those types of things for longer periods of time. The cognitive symptoms means that people usually are going to hold themselves, in a very negative like view and way. So they may think that they are like inadequate, they don't match up to what they need to. They're also going to blame themselves for like every like bad or unfortunate things that happens to them. So this can also kind of show itself as like pessimism. So they don't think that anything will ever kind of get better for themselves. And often you can kind of see these cognitive symptoms in like a therapeutic setting, because you'll notice that the person experiencing depression is going to be procrastinating, and they also, interestingly enough, with depression may also present as physical symptoms. Honestly, a lot of people who suffer from depressive disorder can kind of, Comer described, they can be like misdiagnosed at first. Now, there's also about 8 different criteria for a mood disorder. So for someone to be diagnosed with a mood disorder, they need to exhibit these symptoms for at least 3 to 4 of these symptoms for 2 or more weeks for it to qualify as at least major depressive disorder. So the first one is going to be they have to have an extreme weight or appetite change. Maybe they're experiencing daily insomnia, which would be a more physical symptom. They're agitated, or they're either getting very agitated or they just aren't engaging in as many physical activities, so like less motor activity than normal. They may experience lethargy, fatigue, or as I said earlier, feelings of worthlessness. They may not be able to concentrate as well with their school or with their like work environment. They may repeatedly focus on topics of death and even suicide, which is definitely on the more dangerous end of the spectrum. And the 8th one is going to be just kind of overall, they're going to experience significant impairment and distress. So to me, the way that you would kind of look for these criteria really changes from person to person. I think everyone is kind of on a spectrum, and it's kind of, that's why I think the DSM-5-TR kind of has this idea that you have to have 3 to 4 of these symptoms, because for each person it's going to kind of present differently. And therefore I think, as I'm going to kind of get into later, the treatment also kind of has to adapt itself to each person's unique situation. There are many reasons that can kind of be traced back to why major depressive disorder and other mood disorders kind of come about. The biological theory kind of states that some people might inherit like a predisposition, especially to like unipolar depression. So genetically might be some tie. There's also maybe some biochemical reasons why. So if you have lower amounts of serotonin or norepinephrine, those have also been strongly linked, because a lot of the medications that we now use, like with antidepressants, are going to kind of combat the lowered serotonin and norepinephrine activities. The psychodynamic views, this kind of could have come from early childhood, looking at like how a child who maybe didn't have like parents who were there all the time, might feel separated and kind of withdrawn from the people in their lives. So this could also lead to depressive tendencies as they get older. Behavioral therapists kind of think that it comes from a reward and punishment perspective. So like, don't get enough social rewards, that you might kind of be more likely to experience or depressive symptoms. Cognitive theorists kind of tie it back to this idea of learned helplessness. Think that you don't have control over the rewards and punishments in your life, that you may go into a like kind of helpless state where you think that you can't control the negative things that happen around you. So they would kind of work to reframe that in cognitive behavioral therapy. Finally, sociocultural theorists are going to think that it kind of can be tied back to outside stressors. So whether from a family social perspective, which is kind of like interpersonal, like your family members, the things that happen in your direct life, or a multicultural perspective, looking at things like race, economic status, and gender, which we'll kind of talk more about next. But basically, if you kind of have unavailable or unhelpful social support systems, or unhelpful like surrounding support systems, this could also kind of make it more prevalent in your life. So there are a few different treatment options for depressive symptoms or depression in general. They can either be administered separately from one another or like together, depending on what the person kind of needs. It's very more like on the personalized side of things. So looking at it, antidepressants are going to be one of the main options. One example of this would be like SSRIs. Antidepressants are basically going to kind of correct for, as I said earlier, low serotonin or norepinephrine levels. And so those can be used. You can also use cognitive behavioral therapy, also known as CBT, to kind of reframe negative thought patterns, as I kind of talked about already, that may lead to increasing depressive symptoms. So kind of correct for the learned helplessness and anhedonia and other things that may kind of make a person's depression worse. Finally, usually used as a last resort is going to be ECT, or electroconvulsive therapy. Usually it's done in tandem with cognitive behavioral therapy if drug interventions weren't effective. And so and severely drug-resistant clinical depression. They made, for 2.5 weeks, administer kind of like convulsions. And then by pairing that with CBT, it kind of is supposed to make your brain more susceptible to what you're hearing, so you might be more likely to respond better to the treatment. The more people are exposed to outside stressors, so the main ones we've kind of looked at are going to be like bullying, family issues, racial trauma, school performance, insufficient living conditions, the list goes on and on. The more likely they are to experience an extremely pervasive form of a mood or related mental disorder.
But Ruth, with no job, no driver's license, and no high school diploma, was scraping by on cash from having sold the 2 family cars. Ruth moved in with her mother. She and the 4 kids shared one room.
I was really sad because having them all together, sleeping in one mattress, was messed up. I felt it wasn't fair.
She felt like she couldn't help her kids, including the second oldest, who was being bullied at school, crying all the time, and hiding in the closet. Ruth fell into a deep depression.
Everything stressed me. I get angry easily, so my kids were like that. They were screaming at each other, they were fighting a lot, so I thought I was transmitting that to them.
You were transmitting that?
Yes.
That's interesting,
Jack Shonkoff is a pediatrician and director of the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. He says stressful situations provoke a physical response. Anyone can experience toxic stress, but Shonkoff says poverty presents the type of chronic adversity that can cause it. Low-income families are also more likely to live in neighborhoods with high rates of crime, drug abuse, and failing schools. Over the last few years, many other scientists have also found links between growing up poor and differences in cognitive development. Will all kids who grow up in a high poverty situation experience toxic stress or the long-term effects of toxic stress?
Toxic stress has to do with the extent to which adults in a child's life are buffering that child from the stresses around the family and building the child's ability to cope and adapt, which is building resilience. And the most at-risk group are parents who themselves grew up in poverty, were victims of abuse.
So sadly, all of these factors can disproportionately impact different cultural and just groups in general. Specifically, Comer and Comer kind of talked about how because many minority groups are exposed to poverty, this can lead to them going without health care, proper access to nutrition, among many other factors that we've already talked about. They're going to be more likely to develop a what's known as a psychophysiological disorder, so mental, physical disorder. In addition, because minoritized women are going to be at the highest risk of developing a mental health condition. This is because they're less likely to have quality access to health care or be taken seriously, like medically. So their access in the mental and physical health fields are greatly limited. To paraphrase Comer again, while they discuss that there aren't massive differences in how different cultural groups exhibit symptoms of these mood disorders, there's a lot of evidence that's kind of building up that shows that poverty can affect people differently who are in negative special circumstances. So, for example, for Native American people who are living on reservations, almost 50% of the people who are living on that reservation will display those symptoms, if that makes sense. And so I think that in the combination of the stigma they face, pre-existing biases they may have against mental health care, even the accessibility, especially in more impoverished areas, is going to be really limited. And then all of this is kind of going to lead to discrimination. So this all kind of increases their chances of developing a mood disorder and also decreases their access. To further understand this topic, I looked on a global scale at 2 different studies that were kind of conducted internationally. So the first one was Williams et al. It was conducted in 2011. So basically they aimed to kind of see how socioeconomic status kind of across an entire area, instead of just, so in the past it had only been conducted on individual people, influences individuals or people as a whole's chances of developing a mood disorder. So the researchers did a series of clinical interviews. It was conducted in Australia, and they found that lower socioeconomic groups were twice as likely to have a mood disorder compared to other groups. However, they also found, contrary to what I learned in Comer and Comer, that a higher socioeconomic factor doesn't necessarily protect people from developing a mood or anxiety disorder. So even if you are somebody who is a little bit better off in a higher socioeconomic status, those protective factors aren't necessarily going to inhibit the onset of a mood disorder. So the next study I kind of looked at, which expanded on this a bit more, was Pearson et al. This was conducted in 2013, and they instead looked at how deprivation and the effects of, quote, and its effects on, quote, chronic stress and poor mental health. So they went to very socially isolated areas. They went to New Zealand, like kind of like islands in New Zealand, and they found ultimately that areas that were more isolated showed a higher proportion of the population with a mood anxiety disorder. So mood disorder or anxiety. This suggested kind of to me that less diverse community engagement, so like if you aren't able to engage with like a lot of the community just in daily life, and more isolation can lead to a higher number of stressors kind of being onset onto you, and then also potentially even more discriminatory behaviors, which could lead to more of a risk factor for a mood disorder. In class, we also discussed the APA Deep Poverty Initiative Challenge, which kind of talked about how over 18 million people in the U.S. alone experience deep poverty. So this is really interesting to read up on, because this challenge kind of aimed to help encourage people to advocate against deep poverty, but do it kind of from a community like level first. So figure out how to kind of help poverty in your own community and then kind of extend that nationally. So I thought that was really interesting as well. So let's kind of come back to our treatment options once again. I know we already talked about how you could do antidepressants or CBT or even ECT to treat mood disorders, but it's important to also think about how treatment can be catered to the individual, especially with these new cultural considerations in mind. So looking at especially Comer and some of the in-class activities we did, I've kind of come to the conclusion that mood disorders are best treated, I think, in a community level intervention setting. So especially if the individuals in the community don't have access or funds for more personalized mental health care options like CBT, or if the type of mood disorder they're experiencing is coming from a common cause across the community. So for example, like in New Zealand on the more isolated islands, how people were more likely to have a mood disorder there, where they could kind of talk to each other and relate. I think that they would benefit from communication across their area with like similar peers. In addition, I think that sociocultural theorists are also going to recommend using methods such as the cultural formulation interview and other baseline assessments, because those will help to kind of figure out the patient's level of comfortability with therapy, where they're at, how they perceive the therapist, how they perceive themselves, and that can kind of range across the cultural spectrum. So it's important to really try to understand the patient and what they need when they are looking to receive mental health care. So I think some combination of community level interventions mixed with some kind of baseline assessment like the cultural formulation interview or other options would be really helpful in this. So one of the main things we can look at too in future directions with where we could take people who are in impoverished situations experiencing mood disorders in this kind of line of research is look to increase accessibility to quality mental and physical health care for people who are in lower socioeconomic situations and for people who are facing mood disorders, because it's shown that those two things are definitely correlated in some way. I also think it's important to kind of conduct unbiased research that kind of samples evenly throughout the different socioeconomic spectrums within our population and also on a global scale, and continue to use resources like the CFI interview, cultural formulation interview, and other baseline assessments so that we can kind of assess each person as a unique individual as clinicians instead of treating each person the exact same with standardized assessments that may not represent all of who they are. So thank you so much for listening today.